Good morning. Let's talk about gender and how it affects behavior. As we're starting to talk about gender, I think we need to talk about some concepts that you're going to see in this chapter that are a little bit confusing and maybe used differently than other people might use it. So, for example, sex refers to the biological pieces. So, in particular, we're talking about chromosomes. So, what sex chromosomes does someone have? Gender, we're talking about the characteristics that are cultural in origin. So, think about the way that our culture influences how we see ourselves as male or female. Gender role refers to how we act that out. And you'll see a whole variety of different kinds of gender roles that are acceptable. Now, in general, in the US, gender roles for women are a little broader than men. So, we just need to think about what is okay and where do we start shaming people for stepping outside their gender roles. Gender identity is who we see ourselves to be. Do we see ourselves as male or female or some other identity? And sexual orientation is sometimes referred to as affectional orientation, is who we choose to love. So there are a number of gender stereotypes for both men and women. I'm not going to go through this entire list, but men are described more in terms of instrumental traits, things like being active, analytical, athletic, competitive, financial provider, good at numbers. Women are described more in terms of expressive traits, artistic, emotionally aware, creative, nurturing, and selfless, emotional, gentle, kind. And you can see how these gender stereotypes fit with, expected gender roles. Now, Braverman and her colleagues asked college students about those characteristics that they perceived as part of being male, female, or healthy adults. And in general, as we saw in the last slide, instrumental traits are more associated with males, expressive traits more with females, and healthy adults are much more likely to be described using instrumental traits. Now think about what that means. It suggests that the ways that men are socialized to behave are perceived as healthy, and that the ways that women are socialized to behave are less likely to be perceived as healthy. So we talked, we've talked about these two squares here. So masculine gender typed, where we're seeing a predominance of instrumental traits, female gender typed, high femininity score, low masculinity score, more expressive traits. Someone who is androgynous, we're seeing much more of both, so both feminine traits and masculine traits are high, and undifferentiated, both are relatively low. And people like Bem argued that that being androgynous, being able to be both assertive and nurturing, to be active and curious as well as gentle and kind, was psychologically more healthy. The evidence seems to be a little bit more mixed at this point. In general, although we see males and females as being very different, sometimes we talk about men as being from Mars and women from Venus. In general, for most traits, these differences are really pretty small. Here we're talking about the average difference between men and women. And you see that this difference is small relative to this big range for women and relative to this large range for men. And as we're thinking about what it means to be male or female, we need to recognize that there is a lot of variability within a gender. And we're going to see those same ideas in terms of race, that while we may talk about average differences between different races, different cultures, that there's still a lot of variability. Now, when we're thinking about race, when we're thinking about gender, but also race, we have to be aware that there is a perceiver, someone who is seeing what men and women are doing. And this cartoon, I think, says something important, recognizing that how we see things depends on what we think it is, that we are going to give a different label to men if they're engaging in that behavior than women if they're engaging it. So men, if they are physically or let's say verbally aggressive, we'll talk about them being assertive or aggressive and use much more positive language, where women were much more likely to talk about them being bitchy and use more negative language to talk about what they're doing, to describe what they're doing. Now, there are some real differences between men and women. This is the number of people who are sent to prison for various sorts of crimes. And predominantly, if we're looking at violent crimes, these are predominantly male. On the other hand, part of this may be, while in the last slide we're saying, well, it looks like there's some real evidence for differences in physical aggression for men and women. We also need to be aware of the context. And so in this slide, or this figure, you're seeing that when the man is in a high power position, they are much more likely to engage in visual dominance behavior. And that's also the case in just a control condition. But if the woman is in a high power position, that flips. And so it says perhaps that the reason that men are engaging in much more visual dominance behavior in these two situations is that that they have more power, and that it's a power rather than the gender that produces this visual dominance behavior. Okay, take care. I'll see you for the next video. Bye-bye.